Hey, welcome back to MetFlex and Chill. This is your host, Rachel Gregory, and today I am recording a solo Q&A podcast. So it's been a while since I've recorded one of these. I've been spending a lot of time interviewing guests. So if you've been tuning in to the podcast the last few months, you'll see that there are not that many solo episodes, but lots of new guest episodes, lots of different topics that we've been covering. So definitely check those out if you haven't already. I'm really excited to continue to get new guests on the show and share with you, their knowledge and learn from them and all of that. So without further ado, let's get into these questions. We have quite a few here today, and yeah, let's do it. All right, the first question is a two-part question. So I'm going to start with the first part of it, which is, what are the best resources to get nutritional info of different whole foods? I always see discrepancies between websites. Okay, great question. So there's always going to be slight discrepancies between different foods, depending on where you're searching for them, whether it's on just Google, on different websites, like you mentioned, or in different databases, whether it's MyFitnessPal, Senza, Chronometer, or whatever it may be. But typically, it's going to be very minor in the differences in the, especially with whole foods, unless it's just a complete error in the database, which there are, especially in the bigger databases like MyFitnessPal. There's a lot of errors in certain food items because they allow users to enter food items, and sometimes they get either entered wrong or there's a typo or whatever it may be. So I always recommend that my clients double check by just Googling the food and adding the word nutrition or nutrition facts after it, especially if it's a whole food. It's not like a packaged food that you're scanning or anything like that. If it's a whole food and you're confused on the macronutrient breakdown, the nutrition breakdown of that food, and you're seeing discrepancies between different websites like you mentioned, the easiest way, or if you're tracking MyFitnessPal and you see all these different nutrition info for the same food, the easiest way to double check that info and to make sure that it's accurate is to just put the name of the food into Google and then put the word nutrition or nutrition facts after it. And what that's going to do, it's going to pull up the nutritional info from the USDA database. That's where Google actually pulls its data from. If you're just looking at the Google nutrition facts. So when you Google a food, it should pop up with a nutrition label. You'll see it right in that Google search. Before you actually press on a website, you should see that come up. If you type in any whole food, type nutrition after it or nutrition facts, you'll see a nutrition fact label come up. And that is from, Google is pulling that information from the USDA database, which is the most accurate and comprehensive database when it comes to the composition of food, especially when we're looking at whole foods, right? So whether it's a potato or a different type of meat or a vegetable or something like that. I don't know why potato came to mind. Someone just asked me about potatoes a half hour ago on Instagram. I don't know. Anyway, if you're looking for the nutrition facts of potato, you can just type it into Google and put nutrition after the word, and you'll see it comes up with the nutrition facts label, which again is pulled from the USDA database. Or if you want to just go directly to the USDA database and search for that particular food, again, that's going to be the most accurate place to go. And they've actually recently switched up the database. It's actually not called USDA database anymore. It's called the Food Data Central. So if you just type in Food Data Central to Google, it will bring you, the first link that pops up should be the USDA database. And then it will bring you to their entire database and show you exactly how to search the database. I do recommend taking a few minutes to just read the quick directions on the page because it'll explain how to navigate the different searches and things like that. And what I'll do is I'll add that direct link to the show notes. So if you're interested in checking that out, just go to the show notes and you can click that link and it'll bring you right to the USDA database, which is also referred to as the Food Data Central. So hopefully that answers your question. Again, easiest thing to do is just, if you're ever questioning the nutritional info of a certain food, really just Google it and put nutrition facts after that word. And if it should pop up with that nutrition facts label, and then you can compare it to whatever it spits out in your database. So if you're in MyFitnessPal and you can compare it there, and whatever's the closest will probably be your best bet. And then the second part of this question, how to deal with food labels not being accurate. Okay, another great question. So in case anybody isn't familiar, this question is referring to the fact that the law actually allows a pretty lax margin of error on nutrition food labels. And this margin of error can be up to 20%, which is actually very large if you think about it. So the law literally allows food companies to have a 20% margin of error. So just to give you an easy example, say you have 100 calories of a certain food, and that's what it says on the label. It says it's 100 calories. That could actually be 120 calories, or it could be 80 calories. And that's a 20% difference up or down. And there can also be different discrepancies in the, 20% difference in like the amount of, like if they have a vitamin panel or a mineral panel, there can be a 20% discrepancy in those. So with all that being said, it doesn't seem like a huge difference, right? 100 calories to 120 calories, but it can add up over time. If you're like, say you're consuming, I don't know, 100 calorie pack of something, those 100 calorie packs of like, I don't know, crackers or whatever it is. Say you're consuming like 1 or 2 of those a day, and say that is actually 120 calories in those 2 packs. So that's an extra 40 calories a day. Again, doesn't seem like that much, but then you add that up for 7 days throughout the week. And if you're whatever 40 times 7 is, I don't know the math right now, that's an extra, I think that's 210 calories. No, 280 calories, right? 40 times 7. Okay, hold on. This is bothering me. I should know this. 40 times 7, 280. So an extra 280 calories over that course of 7 days if you're consuming like 200 calorie packs or whatever it is. This is just an example, but that will add up over time. And then especially if you're adding other packaged foods into that, right? And then you're getting even more discrepancies within that. I keep using the word discrepancies because I was answering the previous question. I meant variances. So you could have up to a 20% up or down with that amount of calories or those vitamins or minerals or whatever it may be. So with all that being said, this is why it's best to really minimize, the amount of packaged and processed foods you're consuming. I'm not saying that you have to completely not consume any packaged foods at all, but they just shouldn't make up the majority of your diet, right? Because if packaged and processed foods are making up the majority of your diet, we know in itself that one, there's going to be some confusion if you are really trying to dial in your calorie intake, whether that's to, if you're looking to lose body fat or whatever that may be and get into a deficit, you could be consuming a lot more calories than you think over the course of a week, 2 weeks, etc. So, that's one thing. Another thing is that, packaged and processed foods are obviously less nutrient dense. You're not going to get as much nutrition from them. You're not going to get as much satiety from a lot of these packaged and processed foods. They're easier to overeat. The list goes on. So I always recommend that about 80% of your typical day should include foods that are whole, unpackaged, minimally processed foods, right? So you can think, I say this all the time, think either they had a face at some point or they grew from the earth at some point. That would be considered a whole, unprocessed food, right? So had a face at some point would be any of your animal products, meats, fish, eggs. Eggs come from chickens. They have a face. I would even include dairy within this when we're talking about, yogurt and cottage cheese. I include that in that 80% because those are, although they are, packaged, technically packaged and processed to some degree, they still are minimally, I would say, especially if you're getting a brand that is high quality, and especially if you're consuming maybe raw yogurt or whatever that may be. You don't have to, but just kind of getting nitty gritty on that. But I would put those in more to that 80% because they are less processed, I guess you could say. And they're typically 1 ingredient or 2 ingredients or whatever it may be. And they do come from obviously dairy, which comes from animals. And then the second one was grew from the earth at some point. So obviously those would be any of your veggies, potatoes again, there we go. I think it's because I posted yesterday on my Instagram, I posted like my most common simple meals. And I had sweet potatoes in there, and someone was asking me about the purple sweet potatoes and then asking me some other questions about them. So potatoes are just in my head right now. But those grow from the earth, right? They grow from the ground. So they are considered a whole food. So things like potatoes, squash, fruits, veggies, all of those are going to be considered in that 80%. And then, that other 20% of your day, depending on you as an individual, you could have a whole 100% of your day be whole, unprocessed, unpackaged foods. That would be like, obviously, the perfectionism, the perfectionist. There we go. If someone is trying to be a perfectionist in their the foods that they're consuming, and they're trying to get away from those packaged foods and those processed foods, more of like that paleo approach, then yeah, you're going to be closer to that 90-100% with those unprocessed foods. But for most people, that's not typically realistic. And even if we're talking things like protein powder, for example, I would actually put that more into that 20%, because that is definitely going to be, pretty highly processed, even if you get a good quality brand. So you just want to make sure that you're not kind of overdoing that. So yeah, I'm rambling on now, but the answer to this question is that yes, there is, like, the law literally allows up to a 20% margin of error on nutrition labels for packaged foods. So if you are if you have a lot of packaged foods in your everyday diet and you are wondering, or you're just like really can't figure out why you're not seeing some of the results that you are trying to see, and you feel like you're doing everything right, that could be one culprit that's causing you to have slower results than you could have gotten if you focused mostly on those whole foods. So hopefully that answers your question, or your two questions there. Okay, next question is a training related question. So the question is it good to build your quads if you have knee injuries? And then the second part of this question is, what are the best exercises for building quads? So the answer to the first question is yes. You definitely want to have a good balance of overall muscle in your lower body and in your body in general, but just to optimize the health of all of your joints, right? We want to have a good balance of posterior to anterior muscles. All of that is very, very important, especially when it comes to your knees. So if you're not training like your quads, your hamstrings, your calves, etc., that can actually lead to imbalances within those different musculatures. And that could also in itself just cause injuries, right? So if you have imbalances and you're not paying attention, like if you're just paying attention to doing tons of hamstring and glute movements because you don't want your quads to get quote unquote big, that is probably a mistake. It is definitely a mistake, because you are going to be kind of detraining your quads, and you're not going to be, you're going to have some imbalances between the anterior posterior, which can lead to potential injuries down the line. Or if you're already struggling with some knee injuries, and you're not, paying attention to training both, like I said, or your quads, your hamstrings, like all of that, right? If you're not paying attention to balancing that out, then it could potentially lead to even more injuries and imbalances in that regard. So to answer that question in a long-winded way, yes, building your quads is important, and training your quads is important if you have knee injuries. We can get into some other, particular things within the specific person. Like some people might have overdeveloped quads compared to their hamstrings and glutes. So that's when I would say, okay, let's, take an individual approach, look at what you're doing, what exercises, like we might want to put a little bit more frequency, well, I couldn't say that word, on your hamstrings and your glutes and training the posterior than we would the anterior part of your body or your lower body. But that doesn't mean that we're just going to stop training your quads altogether. Like we still need to have some stimulus happening there. So, yeah, definitely want to make sure you're balancing that out and you're training all musculature. So the second part of this question, what are the best exercises for building your quads? Okay, so when we ask the question of, what are the best quote unquote exercises to building a certain muscle, you want to make sure that not just what exercise you're doing, but what you're targeting with that specific exercise, right? Just versus just saying maybe, squats are good for quads because, of this reason. But squats and the person doing the squats and the way that they're doing the squats, it could actually be completely different, right? Because there's different ways that you can set up an exercise to emphasize or target different types or different parts of your muscles, right? So for example, if you are doing a squat that is a quad dominant squat, that is going to be looking at how much knee flexion you're getting. It's going to be looking at really, what your range of motion is like, right? Are you getting deep enough that you can get a good amount of knee flexion to actually stimulate those quads versus if your goal with your squat was to really target or emphasize your glutes, then you would be looking at hip flexion more and not trying to get as much knee flexion. So those are just a few quick things, but behind the reasoning behind saying, what's the best exercise for X? It's really not that. It's like, how can I choose the best exercise, but also, or first of all, how can I choose the best exercise for my personal anatomy and biomechanics? And then how can I set up that exercise so that it's targeting the tissue that I want it to target, right? So for the quads, for example, we're looking to maximize knee flexion, right? Because that's where we know that the quads are doing most of the work with when we're, getting into that knee flexion. So I always like to think about this as you're touching, like when you're doing any type of lower body movement with your quads, any lower body movement where you're targeting your quads, thinking about this helps me, and it's not for everybody. It doesn't, pertain to every single person, especially depending on your specific range of motion. But touching hamstrings to calves can be a really good cue to think about when you are trying to get full knee flexion. So if you think about, when you're doing a squat or when you're doing a leg press, those are going to be movements where we want to emphasize as much knee flexion as possible to stimulate the quads to the greatest degree. And thinking about knee flexion, think about your hamstrings touching your calves. That's going to be pretty much where we get that optimal knee flexion for most people, not everybody, but for most people. And then you also have to make sure that you're kind of setting up the exercise and making sure that you're executing it properly. And, for example, if we're doing a hack squat, if you are coming down and touching your hamstrings to your quads, you want to make sure that you're not, like, your back's not coming off the pad and your heels aren't coming off the platform and things like that. So all those kind of technique things that we need to pay attention to when we're doing specific exercises. So a few of my personal favorites for emphasizing the quads. And one more thing I'll say before this is that, with different exercises, it's not that the quads are only doing the work, especially when we're talking about like more compound exercises. So I would just mention squats, leg press, things like that. It's not that we have, if I say a quad emphasized hack squat or a quad dominant leg press, that doesn't mean that the other muscles aren't working, right? It doesn't mean that you're just completely, like if you're doing a quad emphasized hack squat, that doesn't mean that your glutes are not working at all or your other muscles in your lower body are not working at all. That's not the case. It just means that we are emphasizing the quads and we're setting it up so that we can get, again, example for a hack squat, get maximal knee flexion to emphasize those or emphasize targeting that tissue, that particular tissue, which would be your quad muscles, right? The four muscles that you have in your thigh, which are quad. Okay, so finally getting into my favorites. So the first one would probably be like I just mentioned, the quad emphasized hack squat. So if you have a hack squat machine in your gym, this is a great movement to really target your quads because you can just set yourself up in the machine. You don't need to be thinking too much about stabilization within the other parts of your body, which can be a drawback of, say, back squats, for example, if you're doing quad emphasized back squats, which that's another one, but I'll talk about that in a second. So hack squats are great. Typically for most people, if you're trying to target the quads and trying to get as much knee flexion as possible, you're going to want to have your feet lower on the platform versus if it was a glute emphasized hack squat, you would have your knees higher, or your feet higher on the platform to get actually less knee flexion and more hip flexion. So anyway, quad emphasized hack squats would be probably my number one. I also like, if I don't have access to a hack squat machine, heel elevated barbell squats are great. So when you're elevating your heels, typically it allows you to get more range of motion within your ankle joint, which allows you to get more knee flexion for most people, especially if you have crappy ankle mobility like I do. Elevating your heels when you're doing any type of bilateral squat or single leg squat can really help you to get more of that range of motion, more of that knee flexion. So heel elevated barbell squats or a safety bar squat. Safety bar is just those, if you're in a gym and you see a bar that has those handles that come down in front of you, that's a safety bar. That is a really good piece of equipment if you haven't used it before. So feet elevated barbell squat or safety bar squats, front foot heel elevated split squats are another one of my favorites. So again, you're elevating that front foot. And when you're doing this split squat, you are focused on driving your knee forward and actually driving your knee over your toes. A lot of people think that you're not supposed to do that because they've heard from someone else that you're not supposed to, your knees aren't supposed to come over your toes, which we know now is just and I was actually told that when I was in undergrad, when I was studying athletic training, and the textbooks that we use to learn and stuff, like a lot of that stuff can be outdated and actually very inaccurate. So you want to make sure that the source that you're using for your information is obviously up to date and actually focused on the things that you're trying to focus on, right? So we know that, your knee coming over your toe is not necessarily bad, especially if we're trying to get maximal knee flexion. That's going to happen for most people. And actually that's what we want to think about, is especially with a front foot heel elevated split squat. This is where you're going to want to focus on, again, driving your knee forward and back versus driving up and down. So there's a lot of different cues and setup techniques that you want to pay attention to with that. Can't really go through all that on the podcast. There's a lot of, obviously, visual things that need to happen with that. But that's something that I work on with my personal clients when they send me form videos and things like that. We are focusing on making sure that we're executing the movement properly for the specific tissue that we are targeting, right? So if it's quads, you want to make sure that we are getting maximal knee flexion, thinking about driving the knee forward and back versus up and down when we're doing those front foot heel elevated split squats. A few more. So I talked about this one already, a quad dominant leg press. So thinking about putting your feet lower on the platform to maximize that knee flexion, versus if it was a glute dominant leg press, your feet would typically be higher on the platform because you would want to emphasize more hip flexion versus knee flexion. So that's another great one. What else? Heel elevated cyclist squats. This is similar to the heel elevated, barbell squats, but you're actually, instead of having a barbell, you're just holding dumbbells at your side. This is a great one if you're looking to get more of that metabolic stress. So I like to do these as finishers sometimes if I really want to, quote unquote, burn out my quads. It's, not a lot of stress on your spine because you don't have that barbell sitting on your back, but you can hold dumbbells by your side and get a really good stimulus out of this. So heel elevated cyclist squats, you can just Google that if you don't know, if I didn't describe that well, but you're basically just elevating your heels on a plate or a platform or wedge or anything like that, and then holding dumbbells by your side, or you can just do this with body weight, and you are coming down and like I said, touching your hamstrings to your calves to maximize knee flexion. And then lastly, leg extensions. So leg extensions I put this last because I want to chat about this for a second. So leg extensions can be something that are confusing for a lot of people, especially if you've kind of learned the old school, thinking behind leg extension, like a leg extension machine. It is actually the only exercise that challenges your quads, specifically your rectus femoris, which is the only quad muscle that crosses the knee and hip. So you have 4 quad muscles. The rectus femoris is the larger one on top that crosses the knee and the hip. So the leg extension is the only exercise that actually challenges your quads in the shortened position. So when it's contracted. So if you think of the leg extension, you're sitting on that leg extension machine and you're extending your legs up, extending your knees up, and you're squeezing at the top. That would be the shortened position. And so if you think about, this is the only exercise that you can actually do that. If you think about all the different quad exercises out there, the leg extension is the only machine that does that. Basically the machine that puts you in that position to challenge it in the shortened position. So when you perform exercises that flex at the knee and the hips simultaneously, the rectus femoris actually stays about the same length and thus doesn't contribute much in terms of output. So this is important to think about because you want to think about training different muscles in shortened and lengthened positions to make sure you're, training the overall part of the muscle, really. I'm not going to get into super great details here, but really with the leg extension, the biggest thing that I want to talk about here is that some people are told that it's a bad exercise because their knees, bad exercise for their knees because it's an open chain movement. All that means is that there's basically less stability occurring at the joint. So if you think of an open chain movement, your legs are actually off the floor. There's no with other movements, if you're doing a squat or a leg press, you are pushing your feet against something, right? So it's a closed chain movement typically. With an open chain movement, your feet are obviously not pushing against anything. So it's there can be inherently less stability at the joint, but it's really only quote unquote bad if you don't perform it properly, right? So just like any other exercise, there can be, I guess, bad exercises, but when it comes to exercises and execution, all of that, really the issue where it becomes an issue is if you're not performing it correctly, if you're not executing the movement correctly for your personal range of motion, biomechanics, anatomy, all of that, right? So the biggest thing to focus on if you are doing a leg extension is to focus on control and not launching out of the bottom as you extend up, because that's where the issues occur. If you are in a leg extension machine and, as you begin to raise the weight up, you're just like launching it out of the bottom. And then, even if you're squeezing at the top and bringing it back down, if you're doing that in itself is going to cause more instability at the joint there. It's going to cause more it's just going to be basically putting yourself in a compromised position in that sense. And so that is where the issues occur. So if you perform the movement at like a controlled, intentional tempo, you'll be just fine for most people. The caveat I will say here is that if you do have like any like prior knee injuries where you are in this leg extension machine and when you're using it, you're literally feeling pain, then obviously if you're feeling pain with specific movement, then don't do that movement or change up the way that you're doing it and change up the setup to make sure that it's not causing you pain, right? So that would be obviously the caveat there. Or if you're recovering from a specific injury and your physical therapist or your doctor says not to do these exercises, obviously that's a different conversation, right? But when we're talking about just general health, like if you're generally healthy and you are looking to like build up your quads and your lower body and make sure that you are training them to your best ability, you definitely want to include leg extension in your training because that is, again, the only movement that you can train your quads in the shortened position. And that can be important for several different reasons. So hopefully that answered your question. I know I tend to drag on things a lot, but I want to make sure that I explain it as best I can and give you kind of the full picture of what I'm thinking as I'm thinking through answering these questions. So hopefully that made sense and helped a little bit with your quad training. Okay, next question. What are some protein powders without sugar that you trust? Okay, so most protein powders on the market will inherently have minimal sugar and also like minimal other macros outside of just protein, unless it's combined with something else for a specific reason, right? So unless it is a protein powder that's combined with a carb source or a fat source for a different reason, right? But you just, the way to tell the difference between this is literally just to look at the label. So as long as it's mostly protein, that's that's going to be a solid protein powder if you're looking for just protein. But when it comes to without sugar, so again, most of them will have minimal sugar. A lot of the protein powders out there nowadays are using like sweeteners or different types of, whether it's a natural sweetener or an artificial sweetener or whatever it may be. And everybody responds differently to these. Some people have a little bit more sensitivity to different sweeteners than others. So really, it just depends on you and how you personally digest these things. Obviously, choosing a brand that is higher quality is going to be a better choice in general, just not just with the sweetener choice, but also with the quality of that protein powder. And if there's any other, a lot of supplement companies tend to add a lot of fillers and extra things to them that are not necessary. So if you're looking for a protein powder without sugar, really just look at the label and make sure that it doesn't have any other ingredients in it that are, pertaining to other fats or carb sources if you're just wanting that protein. So a few of the brands I personally trust and use, and I will link these in the show notes because I do have discount codes for some of them if you're interested in trying them out. A few of the brands that I really, really trust just because of the quality of all of their ingredients that they use. They get, third-party tested. A lot of these brands I know the owners of actually, so I trust them. So the ones that I use currently and trust are Legion Athletics, True Nutrition, Perfect Keto, and Active Stacks. Those are the first ones that came to mind, or the top 4 that came to mind when it comes to protein powders. They obviously make different kinds. So, whey, collagen, all different kinds. I will link those in the show notes. I'll link all 4 of them with different discount codes if you want to try them out yourself. And yeah, that's my answer to that question. Okay, next question. I've been on the same progressive training program for 1.5 years. Is it time to add different moves? Okay, so this is a good question. It's actually one that I get a lot. And I usually, respond to this question with a lot of other questions because it really just depends on, where you're at in your training, what you're doing. There's a lot of different ways that you can switch training up depending on what's going on and what you're really looking to do within your personal goals. So for example, like the first question I would ask back to you is, have you actually stopped progressing in your training, right? So have you, like when we're talking about progression, right? Progressive overload, adding weight or reps over time, or using different methods of progression, not just adding weight or reps. That's probably the easiest way to track progression, but you can also include obviously different things like different types of tempo training, different intensity techniques, things like that. Those are all forms of progression. Actually executing the movement better is a form of progression as well. But when we're talking about just like looking at progression over time and maybe looking at your logbook, like are you continuously adding weight or reps within that movement over time? And that would be a telltale sign that you are progressing within that movement. You're building muscle, building strength, all of that. So that would be the first question I ask, because really, even if it's been 1.5 years and you've been doing the same movement and you are continuously progressing and you haven't kind of stalled out, then I would say there's really nothing wrong with that, right? If it's a movement that works for you, if you enjoy it, if you're looking to continue progressing in it, then there's literally nothing wrong with that. So that would be my first question, like, have you stopped progressing? My second question would be, are you bored with your training, right? If you've been doing the same thing for 1.5 years, day in and day out, I would assume that you're probably a little bit bored, especially if you haven't been switching things up at all. So that would be my next question. Like, are you bored with your training? If so, then that's probably a telltale sign to switch things up, just so that you can make sure that you're continuing to be engaged in your training and excited about it, right? We don't want to get bored. The next question would be, have you tried different moves to see if some of those moves might be better for your personal anatomy and biomechanics and maybe give you a better stimulus for the muscle tissue that you are trying to target, right? So we kind of going back to the question I answered earlier about quads, for different people, they're going to feel their quads working to a different degree with certain exercises versus another person. And that could be just because of their personal anatomy and their personal biomechanics, right? So making sure that you are testing out some different exercises to make sure that you're, including the exercises in your training program that work for you. So if you've been doing the same thing for a year and a half, but you haven't been trying out anything new, that could be actually causing you to maybe not progress in itself, and could be a setback. So that's something else to think about. Another question would be, are you having any issues with injury or joint aches or anything like that? Sometimes if we, are doing the same exact movement for a long period of time, it can add to, or it can't not add to, it can cause potential joint aches and things like that. Especially if you're doing the exercise in a way that is maybe not as optimal, or execution is compromised or anything like that. So thinking about that is another thing that I would ask you. And then ultimately, like, what is your main goal, right? So going back to the first question, like, is your main goal to build muscle? And if that's the case, really the overarching kind of premise to building muscle is just making sure that you're continuously progressively overloading, right? You're continuously adding a little weight or reps over time, and you're moving forward from there. That would be the telltale sign that you are building muscle, right? So a mistake that a lot of people make when it comes to building muscle in itself is thinking that they do need to switch things up continuously, right? To quote unquote confuse the muscle. This isn't true. This isn't like, you can't quote unquote confuse your muscles. It doesn't really work like that. But just thinking about what you're doing and going back to those questions that I just asked, that would be, those would be signs. If you're answering those questions, if you've stopped progressing, if you're bored, if you are having joint aches and pains, if you are, you haven't tried out different moves in a while, like, those would all be signs that, okay, maybe we should switch some things up, right? But we know that progressive overload is the key in building muscle and really just progressing over time, obviously. So sometimes if you're switching things up too often, it can actually hinder your ability to actually see if you're progressing, right? So if you're continuously changing up movements like every week, like, how do you know if you're progressing if you don't have a basis to track that on, right? So that's why with all of my clients and in all of my programming, we don't switch things up every single week, right? We go through a cycle for at least 3 to 4 weeks, like minimum, to make sure that you are progressing week to week. And then typically we keep our main metric movements in for multiple months, actually, to make sure that we're progressing those. And maybe we switch up some isolation or accessory movements and all of that. But to answer this question, I would say ask yourself the questions that I just asked you. And if it has been a year and a half and you haven't tried anything else out, then yeah, maybe it's time to try some new things out, just for the fact that you might just be bored. So that could be another thing too, as well. Like, if you're bored and you're not pushing yourself in your training and you're not, giving it the intensity that it needs to be able to push yourself to progress, then that in itself is an issue, right? So those are some things that I would just ask yourself as you're kind of answering this question for yourself. All right, 2 more questions here. The next question, what were your macros right after deciding not to be keto? I'm scared that I'll be shocking my body with too much. Okay, so this is literally exactly why I created my Keto for Women program, to answer this exact question, right? So, and to bring you through the different strategies and things that I implemented when I transitioned off of a strict keto diet, and really started to actually see results after being stalled for a long time. So I'm going to link my Keto for Women program in the show notes, so you can check that out if you haven't already. I'm also going to link some previous podcasts that I recorded in the show notes that do actually go into detail on this subject and this question. So I'll link those in the show notes. There's 3 particular ones that I recorded recently. The first one is about reintroducing carbs after keto, so exactly what your question asks. The second is talking about carb ups and carb cycling and how to work those into your regimen. And then the last one that I'll link is about the hierarchy of fat loss and what actually matters when that is your primary goal. So I would highly recommend checking out those episodes. Again, I'll link them in the show notes. And they're also on my website, METFLEXLIFE.com, under the podcast tab. If you want to check them out there, you can just search in that tab. And then I highly recommend checking out my Keto for Women program, which I will link in the show notes, or you can go to METFLEXLIFE.com/keto-for-women, and it will show you what the program's about. It's 3 months long. It will dive into all the specifics within the program. Also, there's lots of feedback from previous members and previous women who have gone through the program, their results, all that jazz. So all of those will be linked in the show notes. All right, last question today. During your building phase, what were your macros? I can't seem to add weight. Okay, so this is another reason why I created another program called Muscle Science for Women. I actually created this with my friend Ashley Van Houten. So if you haven't heard of that program yet, it's literally Muscle Science for Women, how to build muscle as a woman. And we dive into all of the specifics behind that, including giving you a training program, going into details within the training program. There's a lot of education and also chatting all about nutrition for building muscle. And all of that. So if you haven't checked that out yet, you can go to metflexlife.com/MSW and you can actually sign up for the waiting list for the next round. We just completed the first round a few months ago, and we have another round coming up soon. Not exactly sure the date of that yet, but there is a waiting list that's already started. So if you're interested, definitely get on that list at metflexlife.com/MSW. I'll also link that in the show notes. And really just to answer this question in the simplest way possible, if you're in a building phase and your main goal is to build muscle and therefore gain some weight, right? You need to, muscle just doesn't pop out of nowhere. If you're going into an active building phase, right, we need to think about what the main goal is, which is building muscle, which means that we need to see the scale go up a little bit, right? And you need to be in a slight surplus for that to happen. So if you're not gaining weight, you're not in a surplus, right? So this just means that you need to eat more food. It doesn't necessarily mean that you need to change up your macros, which actually, I mean, there's, again, that's a lot more detail. There's a lot more things that we can go into with that. You might need to switch up your macros depending on what you're doing to support your training, especially if you are coming from, a lower carb keto approach and you're looking to build muscle. It's probably going to be advantageous to you to add some carbs into your regimen. But in general, if you mentioned that you can't seem to add weight, that just means that you're not in a surplus. You're not in, and you don't have to be in a huge surplus, but if you're not adding weight, it means that you're just not eating enough, or you're over exerting yourself when it comes to cardio or anything like that. So if you aren't eating enough, but then you're compensating with more cardio, then yeah, you're not going to be, gaining weight in that regard. So again, we cover all the details for how to go about this in the Muscle Science for Women program. Highly recommend checking it out and signing up for the waiting list for the next round and learning more about it at metflexlife.com/MSW. All right. So that is all the questions we have for today. Thank you so much for submitting them on Instagram. I typically post a question box on my Instagram every week or every few weeks. So if you're not following me, you can go to Instagram, and my handle is at rachelgregory.cns. I will also link that in the show notes. Or you can go to my website, metflexlife.com, to check out anything else, other podcasts, other blog posts, all that jazz. And I will hopefully be back with you soon with another Q&A. And yeah, I'll chat with you soon.